The horse was going to kill someone before nightfall. Everyone in the courtyard knew it. The great black stallion, 17 hands tall, legs like carved oak, a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, had already thrown 3 men that morning. The first had walked away with a broken wrist. The second had been carried to the healer's quarters with 2 cracked ribs. The third had not yet regained his senses, and the castle healer, old brother Cedric, had clicked his tongue in a way that said more than any words could. Now the stallion stood alone in the center of the training yard, chest heaving, nostrils wide and red, black coat slicked with sweat and fury. The rope around his neck hung loose and useless, dragging through the muddy earth. No one dared pick it up. The guards lined the fence in silence. The stable master, a broad man named Doran, stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, watching the animal with the particular expression of a man who has run out of ideas but cannot afford to say so aloud. Behind him, a cluster of stable hands whispered among themselves, their breath rising in pale clouds in the cold morning air. It was the first week of the frost month, and winter had arrived without apology. The stones of the great castle of Veldrath were slick with ice, the banners above the towers snapping hard in a wind that smelled of pine and iron. The mountains beyond the outer walls were already white. Inside those walls, behind a pair of heavy oak doors reinforced with iron bands, sat the Alpha King. His name was Xander of Veldrath, and most men preferred not to be in the same room as him when he was displeased. He was displeased now. He stood at the narrow window of his war chamber, looking down at the chaos in the courtyard below, his blue eyes cold and flat as frozen river water. His long black braids fell over one shoulder, bound at intervals with small iron rings that caught the pale morning light. He wore his riding leathers, black, fitted close across the chest with 2 thick straps crossing from shoulder to hip, and the great fur mantle of black wolf pelt that marked him as king lay across the chair behind him, where he had thrown it upon returning from the eastern border 3 days ago, exhausted and carrying the particular silence of a man who had seen things he preferred not to speak of. His general, Roan, stood 2 paces behind him. Roan was a beta of middle years, iron-gray hair cropped close, jaw set in the permanent expression of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. 3 riders, Xander said. His voice was low and even, which was somehow worse than shouting. 3 of my best riders thrown like sacks of grain. The animal is difficult, my king. I purchased that stallion from the Grey Vein traders for a price that could have fed the lower village through winter. He turned from the window. I did not purchase him to stand in my courtyard throwing men into the mud. Roan said nothing, which was the wisest response available. Find someone who can handle him, Xander said. By sundown, or he goes back, and I send his trader's own teeth as a receipt. He moved to the great oak table at the center of the chamber, where maps were spread and weighed down with iron pieces. His braided hair swung forward as he bent over them, and the scar at the corner of his jaw, thin, silver, old, caught the gray light from the window. He dismissed Roan with 2 fingers. The general withdrew. Nellie heard about the horse the way she heard about most things in Veldrath Castle, late, second-hand, and while carrying something heavy. She was crossing the inner courtyard with a bundle of fresh rushes balanced against her hip, her gray wool cloak pulled tight against the cold, the hem already dark with mud from the path between the granary and the great hall. Her gold braid, thick and slightly unraveling at the end, the way it always did by mid-morning, hung over her left shoulder, and her cheeks were flushed deep rose from the wind. She was 23 years old, an Omega of no particular rank, born in the outer village, and brought into castle service 4 years ago after her mother had passed and left her with nothing but a small copper brooch and a knowledge of horses that most people in the castle didn't know she had. That was, in fact, the thing about Nellie. People didn't know many things about her, because she did not speak of herself, and because Omegas in Veldrath were not often asked. She heard the stallion before she saw him. a rolling, furious sound, somewhere between a scream and a storm, and she turned her head toward the training yard without thinking. She saw the great black shape of him through the fence posts, still circling, still heaving. She saw the empty yard around him, and the line of guards who would not move, and Doran the stablemaster standing with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated. Nellie set down her bundle of rushes. "You there." It was one of the younger stable hands, a boy named Pip, backing away from the fence with wide eyes. "You should stay back. He's already broken 2 men this morning." "3, said another voice. "And Brother Cedric says the 3rd one's got a knock to the skull." Nellie looked at the horse. The stallion had stopped circling. He stood at the far end of the yard, sides heaving, and he was looking back at her, his dark eye rolling, his ears flattened. But for just a moment, in the space between one breath and the next, something shifted in his expression. Something that was not fury. Something that looked, almost, like exhaustion. She recognized it. She had felt it herself, more times than she could count. She did not decide to unlatch the gate. It simply happened. Her fingers finding the cold iron of the latch, lifting it, the gate swinging inward with a groan of frozen metal. "What are you doing?" Pip hissed. "Are you mad? Close that gate. Doran will have you flogged." Nellie stepped into the yard. The stallion moved immediately, a hard pivot, body swinging to face her, a sound like thunder rising in his chest. She stopped walking. She did not step back. She did not raise her hands. She simply stood, in her muddy cloak and her linen dress and her worn leather boots, and looked at him. The cold pressed down on the yard like a hand. No one at the fence made a sound. The horse stared at her. She stared at the horse. After a long moment, long enough that several guards exchanged uneasy glances, the stallion dropped his head 2 inches. Just 2 inches. But Nellie exhaled. She began to walk again, slowly, slightly sideways, making herself smaller without crouching, and she started to hum, low, tuneless, the kind of sound her mother had taught her when she was very small, standing in a cold field in the outer village with a frightened mare. "They are not angry," her mother had said. "They are afraid. There is a difference. If you can make yourself into something that is not a threat, they will tell you everything." The stallion snorted. His ears moved, not back, not flat, sideways, listening. She kept humming. She was 12 feet away when she heard the voice behind her, from above, from the window that overlooked the training yard. And it was not a voice she had heard often, but it was a voice that every person within the walls of Veldrath Castle recognized instantly, the way a body recognizes the drop in temperature before a storm. "Can you break a wild horse?" Nellie did not look up. She kept her eyes on the stallion. "No," she said quietly enough that she wasn't sure he'd hear her. A pause. "Then what are you doing?" She took one more slow step forward. The stallion did not move away. "Learning what frightened him," she said. There was no response from the window, but she could feel, in the way that every creature can feel when it is being watched by something larger than itself, that the Alpha King had not moved. She reached out her hand, palm up, fingers loose, and let the stallion breathe her in. He did, for a long moment, sides still heaving, old terror still bright in his dark eye. Then he pressed his nose against her palm. The yard was completely silent, and somewhere above her, on the other side of a heavy stone wall, the Alpha King of Veldrath said something to someone she couldn't hear. And whatever it was, it made Roan look at the small Omega woman in the muddy cloak with an expression he had never worn before in 30 years of service, something close to astonishment. By midday, the stallion had a name. Nellie called him Storm, under her breath, when no one was listening. She did not know that by nightfall, she would be standing in front of the Alpha King himself, and that he would be asking her something far more dangerous, than whether she could tame a horse. The summons came at dusk. Nellie was in the stable, brushing Storm's flank with long, even strokes, when the door swung open and let in a blade of cold air and the silhouette of a royal guard, broad-shouldered, iron-helmed, wearing the black and silver of Veldrath's king's garrison. He looked at the Omega girl crouched beside the great black stallion with the particular expression of a man who has been sent to fetch something and found, instead, something unexpected. "You are the girl from the training yard," he said. Nellie kept brushing. "I am." "The Alpha King requires your presence." She stilled. The brush hovered above Storm's coat for just a moment before she lowered it slowly, setting it on the wooden rail beside her. Storm turned his great head and looked at her, as if sensing the change in her breathing. "Now?" she asked. "Now," said the guard. The Great Hall of Veldrath was a place designed to make people feel small. That was not an accident. It was architecture as a weapon, the same way a drawn sword is a weapon even when it is not swung. The ceiling vaulted high overhead, the stone ribbed with dark timber beams hung with iron candelabras, each one dripping with the wax of 100 candles. The floor was old granite, worn smooth by centuries of boots. At the far end, raised on 3 broad steps of black stone, sat the throne, carved from the petrified trunk of a great northern oak, iron-banded, severe, and occupied. Xander sat with one elbow resting on the arm of the throne, his chin tilted slightly, watching her walk the length of the hall. He had changed from his riding leathers. He wore dark wool now, a deep charcoal tunic belted with thick black leather, his wolf pelt mantle back across his shoulders. His long black braids were pushed back from his face, and the iron rings caught the candlelight in cold flashes. His blue eyes did not move from her as she crossed the floor. To his left stood Roan, arms behind his back, expression carefully neutral. To his right stood a woman Nellie did not recognize, tall, dark-haired, wearing deep green wool trimmed with bronze thread, her posture carrying the particular rigidity of someone who has spent years being important and intends for everyone in the room to know it. Her name, Nellie would learn later, was Lady Serene, the king's high council advisor, and by most accounts, the second most powerful person in Veldrath. Lady Serene was looking at Nellie, the way one looks at a stray cat that has somehow wandered into a formal feast. Nellie stopped at the appropriate distance, 3 paces from the base of the steps, as court protocol demanded, though she had never been taught court protocol, and was operating entirely from instinct and the memory of watching other servants navigate this room. She pressed her hands together in front of her and dipped her head. "My king," she said. Silence. Then, "Look at me." She raised her eyes. Up close, or what passed for close across 15 feet of cold granite. He was different from what she had expected. She had seen the Alpha King at a distance, the way all castle servants saw him. A large shape moving through corridors, a voice behind closed doors, a presence that rearranged the behavior of every person around him, the way a stone dropped in still water rearranges every ripple. She had constructed from those fragments a figure who was mostly power and very little else. She had not expected the tiredness behind his eyes. It was not obvious. It was the kind of tiredness that a man works very hard to bury, and she suspected that most people who looked at Xander of Veldrath saw only what he wanted them to see. The cold blue of his gaze, the width of his shoulders, the absolute stillness that powerful men learn to use as armor. But Nellie had spent years reading creatures that could not speak, and she recognized exhaustion in a body the way she recognized it in a horse. "They tell me you walked into the yard alone," he said, after 3 trained riders had been thrown. "Yes, my king." "Why?" She considered the question honestly, the way she always did, which sometimes created problems for her in conversations. "Because no one else was going to," she said. Roan made a very small sound. Lady Serene's eyes sharpened. Xander's expression did not change, but something shifted in it, something so subtle that she might have imagined it. "You are an Omega," he said. It was not an insult. It was a statement of the hierarchy they both lived inside, spoken plainly. "Yes, my king. Omegas do not enter the king's training yard without permission. No, my king. You are aware that I could have you reprimanded for that." "Yes, my king." A pause stretched between them, long enough to breathe in twice. "And yet," he said, "the horse is calm. The first time in 3 days he has been calm." He turned his gaze briefly to Roan, then back. "Doran tells me you spoke to the animal, that you walked toward him when every trained man in my garrison walked away." Nellie said nothing, because he had not asked her a question. He leaned forward very slightly in his throne. "Can you do it again?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. "Can you do it reliably? Every day, until the animal can be ridden?" She thought of Storm, the roll of his dark eye, the trembling in his flanks, the way he had pressed his nose to her palm, like a creature handing over something fragile and waiting to see if it would be crushed. She thought of what she had felt under his coat, when she ran her hands along his neck. The old scarring, faint but present, just behind his left ear. Something had been done to that horse, before Veldrath. Something that had made trust a foreign country to him. "It will take time," she said. "He has been hurt before. Animals that have been hurt do not forget quickly." "How much time?" "I cannot say yet. It depends on him, not on me." Lady Seren made a sound that was not quite a scoff, but was near enough that Nellie felt it across the room. "My king," Seren said, her voice smooth and practiced. "Surely one of the senior stable hands. Doran's senior hands have already failed." Xander cut her off without raising his voice and without looking at her. He kept his eyes on Nellie. "You will have access to the Stallion every morning, from first light until the bells of the 3rd hour. You will report to Doran on the animal's progress. You will not enter the training yard with anyone else present. The horse has already shown he behaves differently in crowds." Nellie blinked. "My king, my duties in the—" "Your duties will be reassigned." He settled back into the throne. "This is your duty now." She felt the weight of it settle on her, not unpleasantly. Something that felt, startlingly, like purpose. "As you command, my king," she said. He studied her for a moment that lasted 3 full heartbeats longer than it needed to. Then he said something she had not expected at all. "What is your name?" The hall was very quiet. Even the candles seemed to still. "Nellie," she said. "Nellie of the outer village." He repeated it, not aloud, but she could see the shape of it passing behind his eyes, being filed away somewhere. Then he straightened, the moment closing like a book. "You may go, Nellie of the outer village." She dipped her head and turned to leave. She had crossed half the length of the great hall when his voice reached her again, and this time it was quieter, not soft. Xander of Veldrath did not do soft, but lower, the way a sound drops when it is meant for fewer ears. "The horse," he said. "Does he have a name?" She stopped walking. She did not turn around. "Storm," she said. "I think it suits him." Another pause. "It does," said the Alpha King. She walked the rest of the way to the doors in silence, her worn boots quiet on the ancient granite. She did not let herself breathe fully until the iron-banded wood had swung shut behind her and the cold air of the corridor hit her face. Behind her, in the great hall, she did not see what happened next, did not see Xander rise from the throne and move to the narrow window that looked out over the dark shape of the training yard, where Storm stood alone in the torchlight, finally still. Did not see the Alpha King look at the horse for a long moment, one hand resting on the cold stone of the windowsill. Did not hear him say, quietly, to no one in particular. Interesting. But Roan heard it, and Rowan, who had served the Alpha King for 12 years and knew the precise weight of each word the man chose to spend, turned the single word over in his mind as he followed his king from the hall. In 12 years, Xander of Veldrath had called 3 things interesting. The first had been a military stratagem that changed the outcome of the border war. The second had been a map no one else had been able to read. The third was a young Omega woman in a muddy gray cloak who had walked toward a furious horse while every trained man in the garrison stepped back. Roan found, to his own considerable surprise, that he was not entirely sure how to feel about that. What he was sure of, what he felt in the particular instinct that 12 years of close service had sharpened to something close to a blade, was that something had shifted in the great hall of Veldrath tonight. Something small, like the first crack in river ice before the spring thaw. And those cracks, in his experience, had a way of becoming floods. 3 days passed. Each morning, before the castle had fully woken, before the kitchen fires were fully stoked, and before the first bells had rung across the frost-white rooftops of Veldrath, Nellie was already in the stable. She came in the gray hour before dawn, her breath a pale cloud, her gray cloak wrapped tight against the cold that had settled into the castle stones like something that intended to stay. She carried with her a small bundle, dried apple slices wrapped in cloth, a handful of oats, and sometimes, when she could manage it without Doran noticing, a bit of honeycomb from the kitchen stores that Cook Marin set aside for special occasions, and pretended not to notice going missing. Storm heard her coming before she reached the stable door. She could tell by the shift in sound, the restless movement of hooves on straw giving way to something quieter, more attentive. Waiting. On the first morning, he had taken the apple from her palm and immediately retreated to the far corner, watching her with one dark eye from across the stable. On the second morning, he had stayed close enough for her to rest her hand briefly on his neck, just below the mane. On the third morning, he had dropped his great head onto her shoulder and stood there, heavy and warm and smelling of hay and cold earth, while she breathed steadily and did not move, and felt something in her own chest loosen that she had not known was tight. "You are both disasters," she told him quietly on that third morning. "You and me. We simply hide it differently." Storm exhaled against her neck, warm and slow. It was on that third afternoon that she first saw Lady Seren watching her. Nellie had moved Storm out to the smaller paddock beside the stable, not the main training yard which still carried the tension of the previous days like a scent, and was working him on a long rope, asking him to move in wide circles, just to move with her, to feel that her direction was not a command but a suggestion he could choose to follow. It was slow work, deliberate. The kind of work that most people, watching from outside, would have called nothing. She felt the gaze before she saw it. Lady Seren stood at the corner of the paddock fence, wrapped in a heavy cloak of deep green wool, lined with gray fur at the collar. She was not quite watching Storm. She was watching Nellie. Her expression was the kind that had been practiced into neutrality. The court expression. The expression of a woman who had learned that showing what she thought was a form of vulnerability. But underneath it, Nellie caught something. Not hostility precisely, something more careful than that. Suspicion. "You have no formal training," Lady Seren said. It was not a question. "No, my lady." Nellie kept her attention on Storm, letting the rope run easy through her fingers. "My mother taught me." "Your mother was a stable hand." "My mother was an Omega of the outer village, who kept 3 horses on a 1/4 acre of frozen ground and never lost one." A pause. "I suppose that is a kind of training." Lady Seren was quiet for a moment. Storm completed his circle and turned his head briefly toward the fence, not threatened, just curious, before continuing. "The king does not make impulsive decisions," Seren said. The words were measured, each one placed with the care of a woman laying stones across a stream. "When he acts quickly, it is because he has already been thinking for a long time. I want you to understand that." Nellie glanced at her then, briefly, before returning her eyes to Storm. "I am not sure what you are telling me, my lady." "I am telling you," Seren said, "that his interest in the horse is not only about the horse." The rope went still in Nellie's hands for just a breath. "My lady," she said carefully, "I am an Omega servant. I am here to work with the Stallion. That is all I am here for." Lady Seren looked at her for a long moment, that practiced, measuring look. And then she said something unexpected. "I was an Omega once, before I earned my position on the council." Her voice did not change, but something behind it did, briefly, like a candle flame bending in a draft. "I know what it is to be underestimated. I also know what it is to be placed in a position that is larger than you were told." She turned and walked back toward the castle without another word, her green cloak sweeping the frost-stiffened grass. Nellie stood in the paddock and watched her go. Storm nudged her shoulder from behind, impatient, and she let out a breath and turned back to him. "What do you think she meant?" she asked him. He snorted, which she decided to take as "I have no idea, but I'm hungry." She did not have to wait long to begin to understand. On the fourth morning, she arrived at the stable to find someone already there. Not a guard, not Doran, not Pip the stable hand. Xander of Veldrath was standing outside Storm's stall, arms crossed, still wearing the clothes of a man who had not yet attended to court duties. A simpler dark tunic, no mantle, the leather bracer on his left forearm, the only armored thing about him. His black braids were loose from their iron rings, falling over one shoulder. He was looking at the horse through the slats of the stall, with an expression Nellie had not seen on him before. Something quiet, almost careful. She stopped in the stable doorway. He heard her immediately. Alphas always did, especially one like him, whose senses were spoken of in tones usually reserved for things that lived in forests and didn't have names. And he turned his head, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the length of the stable. "My king," she said, "I did not know you would be here." "I walk where I choose," he said. It was not unkind. It was simply a fact, stated the way facts are stated by men who have never had to ask permission for anything. She moved into the stable, set her bundle down on the rail, unwrapped the apple slices. Storm was already awake and alert, his ears tracking Xander with something between curiosity and old wariness. "He knows you are an alpha," she said, watching the horse. "He can smell it." Does that trouble him? It did, less now. She held out an apple slice toward the stall, and Storm came forward to take it, his dark eye sliding briefly toward Xander, and then back to Nellie. He is learning that something being large and powerful does not mean it intends to hurt him. A silence. "How did you know to walk toward him?" Xander asked. His voice in the quiet of the stable was different from his voice in the great hall. Lower, less armored somehow. "That first morning, when everyone else stepped back." Nellie considered. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I recognized something in him." "What?" She ran her hand along Storm's neck, feeling the warmth of him under her palm. "He wasn't angry," she said. "He was frightened. Something had hurt him. Badly, and more than once, I think. And he had decided that the only way to survive was to make himself into something that nothing would dare touch." She paused. Anger is easy to recognize. Fear underneath anger is harder. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The stable was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees beyond the outer wall, a low and constant sound. "And you simply walked toward it," Xander said. Someone had to. She felt him looking at her, not the way he had looked at her in the great hall, with the assessing gaze of a king measuring a servant's usefulness. Something different. Something that made her keep her eyes carefully on Storm, and her hands busy, and her breathing steady. "You said he was hurt before he came here." Xander said. The Grey Vein traders. Yes. I found old scarring behind his left ear, consistent with a specific kind of restraint, the kind that causes pain when the animal resists. Her jaw tightened slightly. He learned that resistance meant pain, so he stopped resisting and started attacking instead. It is a different strategy, but the same route. Xander was quiet for a moment. Then, I will send word to the Grey Vein trading post. She glanced at him, surprised. It will not help Storm, he said, meeting her eyes briefly, but it may help the next horse. Nellie looked back at Storm. She did not let herself think too carefully about what that sentence had done to the place behind her ribs. My king, she said quietly. May I ask you something? You may ask. Why does this horse matter so much to you? You could have sent him back. You could have purchased another. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. My father gave me my first horse when I was 7 years old, Xander said at last. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that was not. A gray mare, half wild. Everyone told him she would never be tamed. A pause. She was the best horse I ever rode. She died on the eastern border 12 years ago, in the same battle where I got this. He touched the silver scar at the corner of his jaw, briefly, like a man touching something he has made peace with but not forgotten. Nellie said nothing. I do not give up on things that others have decided are beyond saving, he said. It is possibly my worst quality. He moved toward the stable door then, and the moment closed behind him like water. But at the doorway he paused, one hand on the old timber frame, not quite turning back. You have until the new moon, he said. That is when the northern lords arrive for the winter council. I will need to ride him in the procession. His voice returned to the tone of a king setting a task. Can it be done? The new moon was 12 days away. Nellie looked at Storm, at his dark eye watching her. Steady now, trusting now, still carrying old fear in the set of his ears, but choosing, moment by moment, to stay. Yes, she said. She heard what might have been, in another man, a quiet exhale of relief. In Xander of Veldrath, it was simply silence. But she was learning. She realized, to read silence. What she did not know, what she could not have known, standing in that warm and hay-scented stable with her hand on a frightened horse, and her heart doing something she refused to name, was that across the castle, in the gray stone corridor outside the council chamber, Lady Seren had stopped walking, had pressed one hand flat against the cold wall, and had closed her eyes with the expression of a woman who has just recognized the beginning of something she is not sure she can stop. 7 days before the new moon, the trouble arrived from the north. It came in the shape of Lord Cavan of House Dressed, a broad man with a gray-streaked beard and small, clever eyes the color of river clay. He was not supposed to arrive until the winter council began, but Lord Cavan had never been the kind of man who arrived when expected. He preferred to arrive when it was inconvenient, which was a strategy that had served him well for 40 years of political maneuvering, and which he had elevated, over time, to something approaching an art form. He rode through the castle gates on a pale horse, followed by 12 men in the dark red cloaks of House Dressed, and he smiled the entire way across the outer courtyard, a wide, comfortable smile that did not reach his river clay eyes. Nellie watched him arrive from the paddock fence where she had been working Storm through a slow series of exercises, asking him to stop, to turn, to yield his shoulder to gentle pressure. Storm watched the arriving party with his ears pricked forward, alert, but not afraid. Progress, measured in the quality of a horse's attention. She would have thought nothing more of Lord Cavan's arrival. Lords came and went through Veldrath's gates, and it was none of her concern, except that Pip appeared at her elbow, breathless from running, and said in a low, urgent voice, Doran says you're to take Storm back inside. Now. The king's orders. Why? Pip glanced at the red-cloaked riders. Lord Cavan's master of horse is with him. Man named Fetch. He's the one who... Pip stopped, swallowed. He's the one who trained Storm. Before. Nellie's hand tightened on the rope. She looked at the arriving party again, and this time she found him. A lean man near the back, riding a brown horse with a hard bit, dressed in dark red like the others, but wearing at his belt a long leather switch that had no business being on a man's belt unless he intended to use it. He had a narrow face and pale eyes, and he was scanning the courtyard with the professional attention of a man cataloging what belonged to him. His gaze found Storm. Storm felt it. The stallion's entire body changed in one breath. Ears flat, neck arched, a trembling that started in his haunches and moved forward through his whole frame like a wave. A sound built in his chest, low and rolling, that was not the sound of a horse about to bolt. It was the sound of a horse remembering something terrible. "Easy," Nellie said, stepping close, putting her body between Storm and the man's line of sight. "Easy. I am here. Look at me." Storm's dark eye found her face. She kept her voice low and steady, the way her mother had taught her, the way she had learned in frozen fields when she was very young. The trembling slowed, but did not stop. She got him back into the stable without incident, but her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady either. That evening, Roan found her in the stable. He came alone, without armor, wearing only a heavy wool traveling cloak, which told her the visit was unofficial. He was a careful man. She had understood that from the first time she had seen him standing behind the king's throne, and careful men did not arrive at stables in the evening without a reason. "You saw Fetch arrive," he said. It was not a question. "I saw what he did to Storm," she said, from 30 feet away, across a crowded courtyard, with only a look. Roan was quiet for a moment, his arms crossed, his gray eyes on Storm's stall. The stallion was calm now, fed and warm, but there was a watchfulness to him that had not been there that morning. "Lord Cavan sold the horse to the Greyvein traders 6 months ago," Roan said. "At the time, he claimed the animal was unmanageable, dangerous. He accepted a poor price and moved on." He paused. What he did not mention was why the horse had become unmanageable. "Fetch," Nellie said. "Fetch," Roan confirmed. "The man has a method. It is effective, in the way that breaking something is effective. The horse performs. But it performs out of fear, and fear in an animal of that size is unpredictable." "He wasn't unmanageable," Nellie said quietly. "He was broken. There is a difference." Roan looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize from him, the expression of a man revising an assessment he had already made. "The king sent a message to the Greyvein trading post," he said, "about the methods used in the horse's training. It seems the post has confirmed the details." He paused again, choosing his next words with the care of a man disarming something. "Lord Cavan does not know that the king knows. And the king? Does he know that Fetch is here, in the castle?" "He knows." Roan's voice was flat. "He is..." A pause that was careful in a different way. "Managing it." Nellie thought of Xander in the stable that morning. The quietness of him, the story of the gray mare, the silver scar, and the 12 years it carried. She thought of what he had said. "I do not give up on things that others have decided are beyond saving." "Roan," she said, "why are you telling me this?" The general was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the castle, and somewhere in the upper corridors a door closed with the deep sound of old timber. "Because," he said at last, "you need to understand what you are in the middle of. And because..." He stopped, and something moved briefly across his weathered face. "You have done something in 7 days that I did not think was possible. And I have been wrong about very few things in 30 years of service, which means that when I am wrong, it tends to matter." He left without explaining further. Nellie stood in the stable for a long time after he was gone, Storm's warm breath moving against her hair, and thought about the thing Lady Seren had said at the paddock fence. "I know what it is to be placed in a position that is larger than you were told." She did not sleep well. In the gray hour before dawn, she was already in the stable, but this time Storm was not the only one unsettled. She sat on the low stool beside his stall, with her cloak wrapped around her, and her braid coming loose at the end. And she thought, which was something she usually tried to avoid doing too much of in the dark, because the dark had a way of making thoughts heavier than they needed to be. She thought about what she was doing here, in this castle, in this stable, with this horse. She had been a servant carrying rushes 4 days ago. She had a pallet in the servants' dormitory, and a copper brooch that had been her mother's, and nothing else that was entirely hers. Now she had a horse that trusted her, a general who came to warn her in unofficial evening visits, a council lady who had shown her the edge of something she hadn't named, and a king who had told her about a gray mare. She was not foolish enough to mistake attention for significance. She was an Omega of the outer village. The world of this castle was not her world, and she had always known it. But something had cracked, somewhere in the last 7 days, something she couldn't quite close back up. She was still sitting there, thinking these careful, unhappy thoughts, when the stable door opened. She expected Pip. She expected perhaps Doran, come to give her the morning's instructions. It was Xander. He stopped when he saw her. A brief pause, barely a full second, but she caught it. He was in his riding leathers again, the black wolf pelt mantle back across his shoulders, his braids bound with their iron rings, every inch of him the Alpha King. But his eyes, when they found her face in the low torchlight of the stable, were doing that thing again. That thing she had no name for, that she kept noticing and kept choosing not to examine. "You are here early," he said. "I could not sleep," she said honestly. He came into the stable and let the door close behind him. Storm's ears pricked forward in greeting. A small thing, a gesture the horse had never made before, and she saw Xander notice it. "He is different," Xander said, looking at Storm. "He knows you now," she said. "You have come every morning. He knows your sound, your smell. He knows you have not hurt him." She paused. "It matters more than most people think. The simple fact of being consistently safe." Xander looked at her. A long look, the kind that had stopped feeling simply like the assessment of a king and started feeling like something else, something she was not equipped to name at 6 a.m. in a cold stable. "Fetch is in the castle," she said, because she needed to say something practical and grounded. "I know. Storm recognized him yesterday, from across the courtyard." "I know." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I intend to address it." "My king—" She stopped, started again. "If Fetch is given access to Storm at any point, it will undo everything. Not in the way of a setback, in the way of something that cannot be repaired. Some fears, once reawakened, cannot be quieted again." He was looking at her steadily. "He will not be given access to Storm." "You are certain, even if Lord Cavan requests it?" "Lord Cavan," Xander said, with a quiet that was colder than the morning air, "does not make requests in Veldrath. He makes visits. There is a difference." She believed him. She wasn't sure if that was wisdom or simply the effect of the way he said it. She stood up from the stool, because sitting while he stood felt suddenly wrong, and she found herself closer to him than she had intended. Close enough to see the fine detail of the iron rings in his braids. Close enough that the warm animal smell of the stable mixed with something else. Something darker and wood smoke edged that she recognized after a confused moment as simply him. She took a step back. He did not. "Nellie." Her name in his voice had a quality she was not going to think about. 5 days remain before the new moon. Yes. "Can he be ridden?" She thought of Storm that morning, the trust in his eye, the steadiness of him, the way he leaned into her hand. Then she thought of yesterday, the trembling, the old fear, woken by a single look from across a courtyard. "Ask me in 3 days," she said. He held her gaze for one long moment. Then he nodded, once, and something in the set of his shoulders shifted, not relaxing precisely, but something, as if he had set down something he had been holding. 3 days, he said. He turned to go. "My king." Her own voice surprised her. He paused. "The gray mare," she said. "What was her name?" A beat of silence. "Wren," he said. And then he was gone. She stood in the stable with Storm's nose against her shoulder, and the name of a dead horse ringing in the cold air, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes in the early morning before the world has fully started, that she was in a great deal of trouble. Not the dangerous kind, the other kind. 2 days before the new moon, Lord Cavan made his move. Nellie did not see it coming, which she would later understand was the point. Men like Cavan did not announce their intentions. They arranged circumstances, quietly and patiently, the way a hunter arranges a blind. And then they waited for something to walk into it. The morning began without warning. She arrived at the stable before dawn as always, her breath clouding in the deep cold, frost crackling under her boots on the path between the dormitory and the outer yard. The castle was still and gray around her. The pine trees beyond the walls were dark shapes against a sky the color of iron. She pushed open the stable door. Storm was not in his stall. She stood for a full 3 seconds processing what she was seeing. The empty straw, the unlatched stall door swinging slightly, the rope that should have been hanging on the post, coiled instead on the floor, as if it had been dropped in haste. Then she was moving. She found Pip in the outer corridor, pale-faced and rigid against the wall, and she grabbed his arm. "Where is he?" Pip's mouth opened and closed. "The training yard," he whispered. "Lord Cavan's man. Fetch. He came before first light. He had a writ. It had the king's seal. Doran said he had to—" She was already running. The training yard was torchlit in the pre-dawn dark, and what she saw when she came through the gate stopped her breathing. Storm was in the center of the yard, on a short rope held by Fetch. And he was not the horse she had spent 10 days rebuilding. He was the horse from before. Ears flat, body shaking, eyes wide and rolling with the whites showing. Every muscle rigid with the particular terror of a creature that has been here before and knows exactly what comes next. Fetch stood with his weight on one hip, the leather switch in his right hand, his pale eyes calculating. He was not striking the horse. He did not need to. The presence of the switch, the familiar grip, the smell of the man. It was enough. It had always been enough. Lord Cavan stood at the edge of the yard in his heavy traveling cloak, watching with his comfortable smile and his river clay eyes, and with him were 2 men she did not recognize. Northern lords, she guessed, early arrivals, witnesses to whatever this was meant to demonstrate. "There," Cavan was saying, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. "You see? The animal is exactly as I described him to the king's traders. Unmanageable. Dangerous. The question of whether he can serve as a royal mount is, step away from that horse." Her own voice in the cold yard was something she had not planned. It came out of her the way a sound comes out of a struck bell, not decided, simply released. Every head in the yard turned. Fetch looked at her with pale eyes that held nothing. "This is not your concern, girl. That horse is in my care by direct order of the Alpha King." She walked forward. Her hands were steady. She was distantly surprised by that. "And whatever writ you used to take him from his stall tonight, I promise you it did not come from the king." Cavan's smile widened, which was somehow worse than if it had disappeared. "Bold claim from a servant." "It is not a claim," said a voice from the gate behind her. "It is a fact." The yard went very still. Xander walked through the gate with Roan 2 steps behind him, and 4 royal guards flanking wide. He wore his full wolf pelt mantle and his riding leathers, the iron rings in his braids catching the torchlight, and his blue eyes moved across the yard with the slow precision of a man who has already accounted for everything he sees and decided what to do about all of it. He stopped when he reached Nellie's side. She felt the warmth of him to her left, solid and steady, and she kept her eyes forward. "Lord Cavan," Xander said, "I was not informed you would be conducting exercises in my training yard before dawn." Cavan's smile had not moved, but something behind it had. "My king, I wished only to demonstrate to our northern colleagues the difficulty of the animal you purchased. As a courtesy. Surely. Show me the writ." A pause. 1 beat too long. "My king?" "The writ bearing my seal that gave Fetch access to my stable." Xander's voice had not changed in volume or tone. It did not need to. "Show it to me." Another pause, shorter this time, because Cavan was too experienced to let silences run away from him. "There may have been a misunderstanding regarding the documentation." "There was no misunderstanding," Xander said. "There was a forgery." Roan. Roan stepped forward and held out his hand to Fetch, with the expression of a man who has been waiting for this moment and has found it satisfying. Fetch, after a long moment in which he appeared to calculate his options and find them poor, produced the writ from his belt and placed it in Roan's hand. Roan examined it briefly and looked up. "The seal is a copy," he said. "Competent work. But the date cipher is wrong." Cavan said nothing. His smile was entirely gone now, replaced by the expression beneath it. Careful, watchful, recalculating. Xander turned to Nellie, only to her. "Can you take him?" he asked quietly, meaning Storm. She was already moving toward the stallion. Fetch released the rope when she approached, not out of courtesy, but because he saw her face, and there was something in it that apparently suggested the rope was going to change hands regardless of what he chose to do. She reached Storm and put both hands on his neck, and she pressed her forehead briefly against the side of his face, and she breathed, long and slow, and felt him begin to breathe with her. "I am here," she said, too low for anyone else to hear. "I am here. You are safe. Look at me." His eye found her face, wild still, but finding her. "Good," she murmured. "Good. Stay with me." Behind her, she heard Xander say, in the tone that ended conversations, "Lord Cavan, inside, now." She did not learn what was said in the council chamber that morning. She spent the next 3 hours in the stable with Storm, not training, not asking anything of him, simply being present. Sitting in the straw beside his stall, speaking occasionally in the low, tuneless way that meant nothing and everything at once. Letting him come to her when he was ready, and not before. He came to her eventually, as she had known he would. By mid-morning, Lady Seren appeared in the stable doorway. She looked at Nellie sitting in the straw with a horse's great head resting against her shoulder, and her court expression did something that was not quite a softening, but was adjacent to it. "Lord Cavan is leaving Veldrath," she said. "He and his men will depart before the noon bells. He will not be attending the winter council." Nellie said nothing. "Fetch has been remanded to the king's custody pending a full inquiry into the methods used in the training of horses across the northern territories." Seren paused. "It is not, on the surface, a significant action, but it sends a message that will travel faster than any rider." "And Lord Cavan?" "A man like Cavan is never entirely finished," Seren said, "but he is finished here, for now." She looked at Storm, at the way the stallion stood, heavy and quiet, against the small Omega woman in the muddy cloak. "You should know," she said, "that the king refused to conduct the inquiry until he had confirmed that you and the horse were unharmed." Nellie kept her eyes on Storm's mane, on the familiar work of her fingers moving through it. "He asked about the horse first," Seren continued, something careful in her voice. "And then he asked about you, in that order, although I suspect the order cost him something." The stable was very quiet. "My lady," Nellie said. "What am I supposed to do with that?" Seren was silent for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she said, "I have no idea, but I thought you deserved to know it." She left, and the stable was warm and still, and Storm breathed steadily under Nellie's hands. The new moon came. On the night before the Winter Council procession, Nellie stood in the training yard in the cold dark with Storm on a long rein, and she asked him one last thing. She asked him to trust her completely. She did not climb onto his back. She simply stood beside him, close, and leaned her weight into his shoulder, and felt, in the quality of his stillness, in the way he shifted his weight to accommodate her rather than away from her, that he had already decided. She rode him for the first time in the silver hour before dawn, with no one watching. No saddle, just his bare back, warm under her hands, and her worn boots hanging loose at his sides, and the cold air moving through her loosened braid as he walked. Not wild, not afraid, not performing from terror, but choosing. Stride by steady stride, choosing to carry her. She did not cry. She simply rode, in circles in the dark, and understood that something that had been broken had been made into something different. Not the same as before the breaking. Different, perhaps better. The procession happened at midday, under a white winter sky. Xander rode Storm. Nellie watched from the edge of the courtyard, standing between Pip and old brother Cedric, her gray cloak around her shoulders, and her braid neat for once, properly bound. She watched the Alpha King ride the black stallion through the gates of Veldrath in front of the assembled northern lords, and she watched Storm carry him. Head high, ears forward, stride long and even, and absolutely unafraid. She felt something move through her chest that she had no word for. Xander's blue eyes found her in the crowd as he passed. He did not smile. He was not, she had come to understand, a man who smiled easily or often. But something happened in his expression, brief and certain, and he held her gaze for 3 full seconds as Storm carried him past, and in those 3 seconds she felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with crowded courtyards or royal processions. She looked away first. Her heart was doing something she firmly instructed it to stop doing. It did not stop. He came to the stable that evening, after the feast, after the council had begun its long formal business of winter. He came alone, without guards, which was either very trusting or very reckless. And she suspected in a man like Xander, those two things were not always different. She was brushing Storm when he arrived, and this time she heard him before she saw him, recognized the particular weight of his step, the scent of wood smoke and cold air that arrived slightly before he did. She did not stop brushing. "He was extraordinary today," Xander said, looking at the horse. "He was ready," she said. "He has been ready for 2 days. He simply needed someone to trust him enough to ask." A silence, in which the stable breathed around them. "Nellie," she stilled. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you told me. About creatures that have learned that resistance means pain, and who stop resisting and start attacking instead." A pause. "You were not speaking only about the horse." She set the brush down on the rail. "No," she said quietly. "I was not." Another silence. Longer. The kind that holds more than silence usually does. "I would ask you something," he said. "And I will tell you plainly that it is not a command. It is a question. The first I have asked in some time, where I did not already know the answer I wanted." She turned to face him. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the gray winter sky the morning they had spoken of Ren, with the particular attention of a man regarding something that matters, who has not quite decided whether to say so. Stay, he said. Not in the stable. Not as a servant. He paused, and for one remarkable moment, the Alpha King of Veldrath looked precisely like a man who is uncertain, and has decided to be uncertain aloud, which is perhaps the bravest thing such a man can do. Stay in whatever way makes sense to you. I am not practiced at this. I am better at riding into border wars than at saying what I'm trying to say. Nellie looked at him for a long moment. You are saying it, she said. Badly but clearly. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something better than a smile. Something real. Will you? He asked. She thought of her mother's copper brooch, of the frozen fields of the outer village, of the pallet in the servants' dormitory, of carrying rushes through courtyards where no one saw her. She thought of Storm pressing his nose to her palm in a silent and frightened yard, and she thought of what her mother had told her about creatures that are not angry but afraid. If you can make yourself into something that is not a threat, they will tell you everything. She reached out and pressed her hand briefly against Xander's forearm, leather and warmth beneath her fingers, and felt him go completely still, the way Storm had gone still, the first time she touched him. Yes, she said. What happened after that took time, as real things do. Storm spent the winter in the finest stall in Veldrath's stable, fat and calm, and occasionally insufferable in the way of horses that know they are beloved. In the spring, Doran observed with great professional reluctance that the black stallion was, without question, the finest animal in the king's stable, and the finest tempered. He did not say that this was Nellie's doing, but he also did not say it was not. Roan, who had served the king for 12 years and considered himself a man not given to sentiment, attended the quiet ceremony in Veldrath's great hall on the first day of the frost month's end with an expression that he would later describe to his wife as entirely professional. His wife, who had known him for 30 years, said nothing and handed him a cloth. Lady Seren stood at the front of the hall because she had earned that position and she intended to keep it, and she watched Nellie of the outer village stand in her winter gray and accept something that no one who had known her in the outer village would have predicted. And she felt, privately, the particular satisfaction of a woman who has watched something she recognized come to its right conclusion. Lord Cavan did not return to Veldrath. He received, at the winter's end, a formal inquiry document from the King's Council regarding the conduct of house-dressed stable practices, which was a polite and devastating thing, and which occupied his attention sufficiently for the following 3 years. Fetch stood before the king's judgment at the new year, and received a sentence that was neither violent nor lenient, but precise, the kind of consequence that is not about punishment, so much as about the clear establishment of where lines are drawn in Veldrath, and what happens when they are crossed. And Nellie, who had carried rushes through a cold courtyard and walked toward a frightened horse, while every trained man stepped back, stood in the great hall of Veldrath on a bright winter morning with her gold braid properly bound for once, and her mother's copper brooch at her collar. And she looked at the Alpha King, who was looking at her with his cold blue eyes that were not cold at all. Not when they looked at her. And she understood something her mother had told her once in a frozen field that she had not, until now, fully believed. The ones that seem wildest, her mother had said, watching a frightened mare in the early morning light, are only the ones that have not yet found the thing that makes them feel safe. Once they find it, they never let it go. Storm, in his stall across the courtyard, lifted his head at exactly that moment, for no reason that anyone could explain, and looked toward the great hall, with his ears pricked forward and his dark eyes bright. Then he dropped his nose back into his hay, entirely content. He was home. So was she.